Hollywood, a city of dreams and deception. Beneath the glimmering lights and the echoes of laughter in the night, there were places where shadows stretched long, concealing whispers of terror. On this particular night, one such whisper would grow into a scream, lost in the quiet hum of the city. A young woman full of promise and energy was preparing for an evening that would never come to pass. Ashley Ellerin was the kind of person who left a mark wherever she went. Her infectious laughter, her boundless ambition, and her undeniable charm made her someone people gravitated toward. At just 22, she had already carved out a space for herself in the cutthroat world of fashion design. With her golden hair and striking features, she was not just beautiful, she was radiant, exuding a confidence that masked the vulnerability beneath. That evening, excitement filled the air. Ashley had plans. She was set to go out with an up-and-coming actor, Ashton Kutcher. It wasn't anything serious, just a fun night out, a chance to unwind. She had spent the day preparing, picking out the perfect outfit, making sure everything was just right. Her friends teased her, but she merely grinned, brushing them off. But the night carried a weight she didn't yet understand. Somewhere beyond the safety of her walls in the dimly lit streets winding through the Hollywood Hills, someone was watching. Someone had been watching for a long time. It had started subtly, almost imperceptibly. A feeling, a sense of being observed. At first she dismissed it as paranoia. After all, Hollywood was filled with curious glances, admirers, strangers who recognized a face and stopped to stare. But this was different. This was persistent. Her car tires had been slashed once. A coincidence, she thought. Her front door had been left unlocked when she was sure she had secured it. Maybe she had forgotten. Then there were the times she'd glimpsed movement from the corner of her eye, a shadow slipping out of view just as she turned. It never made sense, never lasted long enough for her to process. She told herself she was overthinking things. Until the knocking started. Late at night, when the streets were empty, when the only sounds were the occasional howl of the wind or the distant wail of sirens, there would come a knock. Soft, almost gentle. Just one. Then silence. No one there. No footprints. Just the hollow sound lingering in the air. She mentioned it in passing to a friend once, laughing it off, though the tightness in her voice betrayed her. Maybe I have a secret admirer, she had joked, but deep down she wondered. She wondered if someone was testing the boundaries, seeing how close they could get. That evening, Ashley's excitement dulled the unease. The feeling was there, nagging, subtle, but it was easier to ignore in the glow of vanity lights, the rhythm of her music playing in the background. She hummed along as she applied the final touches to her makeup, turning to check herself in the mirror. She looked stunning, the kind of stunning that made her forget, just for a moment, about the fleeting shivers of apprehension. A knock at the door. Her breath hitched, an instinctive reaction, but then she exhaled, rolling her eyes at herself. It was probably Ashton. He was early. She grabbed her phone, glancing at the time. No message. Strange. She moved toward the door, hesitating briefly before swinging it open. No one. The wind whispered against her skin as she stepped outside, peering into the darkness beyond the porch light. The street was empty. A shiver ran down her spine. Closing the door, she locked it, double-checked it. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe it was the neighbor's door she had heard. She shook her head, willing herself to relax. She wasn't going to let paranoia ruin her night. She moved to the living room, sinking onto the couch, scrolling through her phone. Messages, emails, nothing unusual. But the feeling, that gnawing sensation, had returned, clinging to her skin like static. She had just started to brush it off when a noise from the back of the house made her freeze. It wasn't loud, barely more than a whisper, a shuffle, a movement, something unnatural in the silence. Ashley's fingers tightened around her phone. She turned her head slowly, listening, her heart hammering against her ribs. Silence. A second passed, then another. It was probably nothing. Probably. Ashton Kutcher arrived later than expected. He had tried calling a few times, but there had been no answer. Not unusual. Maybe she was in the shower getting ready. As he pulled up outside her house, he noticed something odd. The lights inside were still on, casting a warm glow through the curtains. But there was no movement, no sound. He stepped out of his car, walking up the short path to the front door. He knocked, waited, knocked again. Nothing. Frowning, he leaned in slightly, peering through the window. That was when he saw it. A dark stain on the carpet, just barely visible from where he stood. It looked like spilled wine. Something in his stomach twisted. He knocked again, harder this time, calling out her name. No response. No sound of footsteps, no laughter, no voice telling him she'd be out in a minute. Just silence. A feeling settled in his chest then. Heavy, leaden. Something was wrong. Ashley never came to the door. And inside, past the locked door, past the dim glow of the light, past the illusion of safety, lay the truth waiting to be uncovered. A horror that would soon unfold, leaving a trail of blood and unanswered questions in its wake. The next morning, the sun rose over Hollywood with its usual brilliance, casting golden hues over the hills and the long, winding streets that wove through the city like veins. But in a quiet cul-de-sac, where palm trees stood motionless in the morning breeze, something sinister lingered behind a locked door. Ashley Ellerin had not answered her phone. For those who knew her, that was out of character. She was social, lively, and never one to go completely silent, especially after making plans. When her friends tried calling again, the calls rang unanswered, then went to voicemail. Her absence wasn't just unusual, it felt wrong. By late morning, her friend, who was supposed to meet her that day, decided to check in personally. The drive to her house was short, but each passing block felt heavier, weighed down by a sense of growing dread. Arriving at the house, the first thing her friend noticed was that the front door was closed but not latched properly. That was odd. Ashley was always careful, always mindful of security, especially after the strange experiences she had confided in them about. Footsteps where there should have been none. A lingering presence she couldn't quite shake. Pushing the door open cautiously, a blast of silence met them. The house was still, as if frozen in time. Sunlight streamed in through the curtains, casting long, soft shadows across the floor. Everything appeared normal, almost too normal. Then they saw it, a dark stain, seeping into the fibers of the carpet, irregular in shape but unmistakable. Blood. And then beyond it, something worse. Ashley lay motionless on the floor of her living room, her body twisted unnaturally, her once vibrant skin now eerily pale. The air in the room was thick, stagnant, the scent of something metallic lingering. Her clothes were soaked in red, the fabric torn in places where deep wounds had been inflicted. The attack had been brutal. There was no other way to describe it. She hadn't simply been killed. She had been overpowered, butchered with a force that suggested something far beyond a random act of violence. It took a moment for the initial shock to settle, for reality to register. A scream ripped through the air, shattering the eerie silence. The phone was out in an instant, trembling fingers dialing 911, the words barely forming through the horror. A murder, a horrific, unimaginable murder. The dispatcher's voice was calm, methodical, asking the necessary questions. Was the victim breathing? Was there anyone else inside the house? Had anyone seen anything suspicious? The answer to all of them was the same. No. Ashley was gone, and whoever had done this, whoever had torn her from the world with such unspeakable violence, was nowhere to be found. Within minutes, sirens sliced through the air, growing louder as emergency vehicles raced toward the scene. The flashing red and blue lights cast an eerie glow on the pavement, reflecting off windows and parked cars. Los Angeles homicide detectives, seasoned men and women who had seen death in every conceivable form, stepped onto the property, already piecing together the puzzle in their minds. The forensic team arrived quickly, donning gloves and boot covers, moving with the kind of careful precision that came from experience. The lead investigator, a man with years of dealing with the darkest aspects of humanity, took a slow, assessing glance around the house. The first thing that struck him was the lack of forced entry. The door had been unlocked, slightly ajar. There was no sign of struggle near the entrance. That suggested one of two things. Either Ashley had known her killer and let them in willingly, or they had already been inside waiting for her. The second detail that stood out was the sheer ferocity of the attack. This wasn't an impulsive, single-stab killing. The medical examiner would later confirm that Ashley had been stabbed 47 times. Some wounds were deep, others more superficial, as if the killer had struck over and over, not out of necessity, but out of rage. The third observation was even more unsettling. Whoever had done this had taken their time. One of the detectives knelt beside the body, studying the angles of the wounds. Some were erratic, desperate, while others were precise, almost methodical. This wasn't just about killing, it was about domination, about control. And there was something else, a chilling realization that sent a shiver down the detective's spine. The killer hadn't been in a hurry to leave. In fact, there were small indicators that they had lingered. The faucet in the bathroom had been left running, as if they had washed their hands. A few items were displaced but not ransacked, as though someone had moved them absent-mindedly rather than in a rush. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't a crime of passion. This was something else. The detectives began retracing Ashley's final moments. They started with her last known plans, a date with Ashton Kutcher. Kutcher was cooperative, providing a detailed account of the previous night. He had arrived at her house at around 10:45 p.m. He knocked but got no answer. Peering through the window, he saw what he assumed was a wine stain on the carpet. That detail made every officer in the room pause. What he had seen hadn't been wine. Had he walked away from a murder scene without realizing it? There was no way he could have known. No one would have thought to second-guess a locked door, a silent house, a dark stain that didn't immediately suggest anything sinister. But the implications were haunting. The killer had still been inside the house when he was there. If he had knocked a little harder, waited a little longer, would the door have opened? Would he have seen the killer face to face? Or worse, would the killer have seen him? The investigation was now in full force, and the questions began piling up. Who had done this, and why had they attacked with such brutality? Had Ashley known her killer? Was this someone with an obsession? Someone who had been watching her, waiting for the perfect moment? Had the killer struck before? As forensic specialists swabbed for DNA, as detectives pored over surveillance footage and phone records, the weight of the case grew heavier. Somewhere out there, a murderer was walking free. Someone who had been close enough to Ashley to enter her home, to unleash such unspeakable violence upon her. And if they had done it once, there was a chilling possibility they could do it again. The house on Pinehurst Road had become something else entirely. The echoes of life, of music and laughter, had been erased overnight, replaced by an eerie stillness. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered lightly in the morning breeze as uniformed officers moved in and out, their faces grim, their voices hushed. Inside, the air was thick, the scent of death lingering despite the open windows. The forensic team worked in near silence, their gloved hands meticulously collecting samples, photographing every inch of the space. Blood patterns were studied, footprints were examined, and every small trace of movement inside that house was being reconstructed. Lead investigator Thomas Grant had seen his share of horrors. He had worked on some of the most brutal homicides in Los Angeles. But something about this case sat differently. The violence wasn't just excessive, it was deeply personal. The sheer number of wounds, the way Ashley's body had been left, all pointed to something beyond a simple act of rage. He stood near the doorway, arms crossed, surveying the room. The lack of forced entry was troubling. Either Ashley had known her killer and let them in willingly, or the killer had been inside before she even knew they were there. The thought sent a ripple of unease through him. A home was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of safety. But this was something else. The forensic team called him over. They had found something, a faint trace of foreign blood mixed in with Ashley's. It was almost imperceptible, a small smear on the edge of the carpet. It wasn't hers. That meant only one thing. The killer had injured themselves during the attack. It was the first real lead. If the sample was viable, they could run it through the database, possibly identify a suspect. But Grant knew better than to hope too soon. Sometimes even the most promising evidence led nowhere. Outside, detectives were going door to door, canvassing the neighborhood, asking the same set of questions. Had anyone seen or heard anything unusual? Did they notice unfamiliar cars or people lingering around Ashley's home? Most responses were frustratingly vague. Someone thought they had heard a dog barking around the estimated time of the murder. Another neighbor mentioned a car that seemed to idle longer than usual down the street. But no one had been paying enough attention to recall details. Then an elderly woman hesitated before answering. There was someone, she finally admitted. A man. I've seen him before, hanging around. Always looking, always watching. Grant's posture stiffened. When was the last time you saw him? She thought for a moment. A few nights ago, just standing across the street from her house. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. But it was the way he looked, like he was waiting. A sense of unease crawled up Grant's spine. If this woman was right, then the killer had been stalking Ashley, observing her, studying her routines. This wasn't an impulsive crime. It had been planned. Back at the station, the investigative team gathered around the evidence board. The photos from the crime scene were pinned up, red strings already beginning to connect pieces of information. The timeline was coming together, but there were still too many blanks. Grant ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. Somewhere out there, a predator was walking free, watching, waiting, and they had to find him before he struck again. The weight of the case settled over the investigation room like an oppressive fog. The walls, lined with crime scene photos and notes, seemed to close in on the detectives as they scrutinized every piece of information they had gathered. But no matter how many times they went over it, one fact remained clear. Whoever had done this had planned it meticulously. This wasn't an impulsive act. This was controlled, methodical, and deeply unsettling. The forensic team worked tirelessly, analyzing the blood sample found at the crime scene. It was a fragile lead, but it was something. If they were lucky, it would produce a DNA profile. If they were even luckier, it would match someone already in the system. But forensic work took time, and time was the one thing they didn't have. Detective Thomas Grant leaned over the evidence board, his eyes tracing the scattered fragments of Ashley Ellerin's final hours. They knew she had been home alone that night, preparing for a date. They knew that at some point someone had entered her house, either with her permission or by force, and they knew that whoever it was had spent more time there than they should have. It was that last detail that kept gnawing at him. The crime wasn't just brutal, it was deeply personal. The sheer number of stab wounds suggested an overwhelming level of rage, but at the same time, there were signs of eerie precision. Some wounds were chaotic, wild, delivered in a frenzy. Others were methodical, calculated, as if the killer had switched between two states of mind. It was a contradiction, one that spoke of something far more complex than a simple act of violence. Then there was the unsettling fact that nothing of real value had been taken. Ashley's purse remained on the counter, untouched. Her expensive jewelry lay in plain sight, undisturbed. Her car keys, phone, everything was still there. The only thing missing from that house was the life that had once occupied it. Grant's gut told him they weren't dealing with an ordinary killer. The interviews with friends and acquaintances painted a picture of a woman who had been cautious but not paranoid, someone who had noticed small things but never quite enough to sound an alarm. In the weeks leading up to her death, Ashley had mentioned feeling watched, experiencing unsettling moments, like the sensation of being followed when she walked to her car at night or hearing noises outside her house when she was home alone. At the time, she had brushed it off, but now it felt like those moments had been the prelude to something far more sinister. The unsettling pattern didn't end there. As detectives continued their work, they found a disturbing thread tying her case to another unsolved homicide. Years before, across the country in Illinois, a young woman named Tricia Picacho had been found murdered just outside her home. The circumstances were eerily similar. Multiple stab wounds, no apparent motive, and the unsettling reality that the crime scene suggested the killer had lingered. That case had gone cold. But was it possible they were looking at the same person? The connection was tenuous at best, but the parallels couldn't be ignored. If it was the same perpetrator, then that meant they weren't dealing with someone who had acted on impulse. They were dealing with someone who had done this before. and had possibly been doing it for years. By the second week of the investigation, tension among the detectives had reached a fever pitch. The press had caught wind of the brutal nature of the crime, and speculation was rampant. Theories ranged from a stalker obsessed with Ashley to a targeted attack by someone from her past. Everywhere Grant turned, it felt like the answers were just out of reach, taunting him, lingering in the shadows. He had seen cases like this before, cases where the killer seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving behind only carnage and questions. But killers always made mistakes, and somewhere, hidden in the details, was the one thing that would lead them straight to him. The city moved on as if nothing had happened. Traffic continued to clog the streets of Los Angeles. Actors rehearsed their lines, tourists snapped photos under the Hollywood sign, and the nightlife pulsed with an intoxicating rhythm. But for those involved in the investigation of Ashley Ellerin's murder, the world had narrowed to a single point: a brutal crime scene, a victim who could no longer speak for herself, and a faceless predator who had disappeared into the night. The weight of the case pressed down on the detectives, the forensic teams, the analysts scouring through reports. Everyone knew that cases like this, the ones with no obvious suspect and no immediate arrest, grew colder by the day. A case unsolved for a week could stretch into months, then years, becoming nothing more than a box of yellowed case files buried in a storage unit beneath the weight of time. Detective Thomas Grant wasn't willing to let that happen. He had seen too many cases slip through the cracks. Too many killers evade justice because they had been just careful enough, just lucky enough. Not this time. The forensic team had worked through the night, examining every possible piece of evidence from the crime scene. The blood sample found near Ashley's body had finally yielded a full DNA profile, but it had also led to an unexpected roadblock. There was no immediate match in the criminal database. This was bad news. If the suspect had a record, even for something minor, they would have been flagged. But whoever had left that trace of blood behind had no known history in the system, at least none that was easily accessible. It meant they were either a first-time offender, unlikely given the level of brutality, or they had managed to avoid arrest their entire life. That realization sent a shiver through the investigative team. This wasn't just an isolated act of violence, it was something far worse. Ashley had been stalked. The evidence was mounting. She had expressed unease to her friends about a man who had taken an interest in her, someone who had offered to help with odd jobs around her home, someone whose presence had made her uncomfortable. But like so many women, she had second-guessed herself. She hadn't wanted to seem rude, hadn't wanted to assume the worst, and now she was gone. The detectives worked to trace every connection Ashley had. They pulled phone records, combed through financial statements, and interviewed everyone who had crossed paths with her in the weeks leading up to her murder. But it was like trying to piece together a puzzle when half the pieces were missing. Then came something unexpected. In the middle of sorting through a stack of reports, a detective stumbled upon a file from across the country, an unsolved case in Illinois. The details were eerily familiar. A young woman named Tricia Picacho, just 18 years old, had been murdered outside her home. The crime had remained unsolved for years. Multiple stab wounds. No sign of forced entry, no theft. It was the similarities that sent a ripple of unease through the department. Had they found something? A connection? Or was it just coincidence? But seasoned detectives didn't believe in coincidences. They dug deeper, comparing the two cases side by side, looking for something, anything that could tie them together. The wounds were similar. The level of overkill suggested a killer who wasn't just acting on impulse, but on something darker, something that came from deep inside. A cold realization began to settle in. If this was the same person, then Ashley Ellerin hadn't been the first, and she wouldn't be the last. The idea that they were dealing with a serial offender changed everything. This wasn't just about finding justice for one victim. It was about stopping a predator before he could strike again. But there was one problem. They still didn't know his name, and he was still out there. The crime scene was no longer just a singular tragedy. It was now a part of something much larger, a tangled web of violence that stretched across state lines, spanning years, maybe even decades. What had begun as an investigation into the brutal murder of Ashley Ellerin was rapidly evolving into something more sinister. The search for a killer who had likely taken more lives than anyone had realized. Detective Thomas Grant sat in the dimly lit office, staring at the evidence board that had grown cluttered with crime scene photos, suspect lists, and timelines. The weight of the case pressed on his shoulders like an unbearable force. He had worked homicide long enough to know when a murder was personal and when it was the work of something else, something colder, more calculated. Ashley's case was the latter. The brutality of the crime, the lack of forced entry, the eerie way the killer had lingered. It all pointed to someone who had done this before. And the similarities to the unsolved case in Illinois made it impossible to ignore the possibility that the same man had been stalking his victims for years. But knowing that and proving it were two different things. The DNA sample found at Ashley's crime scene had been their first real lead. The forensic team had worked tirelessly to extract a profile, only to hit a dead end when the sample failed to match anyone in the National Criminal Database. It was a frustrating setback. DNA was only useful if there was something to compare it to. Without a name, it was just an anonymous fingerprint left in blood. Still, they had something. And in a case like this, even the smallest shred of evidence could be the key to unraveling everything. The deeper they dug, the more unsettling the picture became. Ashley had felt uneasy in the weeks leading up to her murder. Friends recalled her mentioning a man she barely knew, someone who had offered to help her with small repairs around the house. She had laughed it off at the time, dismissing her discomfort as paranoia, but the feeling had lingered. She had noticed things, small, unsettling things. A car parked near her house more often than seemed normal. A shadow in her peripheral vision that disappeared when she turned to look. She had never gone to the police. Like so many women, she had doubted herself, convinced that she was imagining things. Now detectives were left to piece together those warnings too late. A week into the investigation, the tension in the precinct was palpable. Every lead felt like it was dragging them towards something they couldn't quite see, just out of reach. The connection to the Illinois case was circumstantial at best, but it was enough to raise alarms. The two victims had never known each other, had lived thousands of miles apart, yet their deaths mirrored each other in chilling ways. The wounds, the method of attack, the way their bodies had been left. It wasn't just rage, it was a ritual, a pattern. And that meant one terrifying thing: this man was going to kill again. Detective Grant knew they needed to act fast. They needed to find out who had been near Ashley in the days leading up to her death. They needed surveillance footage, phone records, anything that could give them even a glimpse of their suspect. They combed through hours of security camera footage from businesses and traffic lights near Ashley's neighborhood. The footage wasn't perfect. Grainy images, bad angles, the frustrating gaps where cameras didn't reach. Then they saw him, a man, lingering near Ashley Street, not walking, not waiting for someone, just watching. His face wasn't clear enough to identify, but he was there, a shadow, silent and patient, waiting for the right moment. The man disappeared from the frame just minutes before the estimated time of Ashley's death. Had he been the one? There was no way to know for sure. But now they had something new, proof that Ashley had been watched, proof that someone had been stalking her home the night she died. And that meant the hunt was officially on. The photograph was grainy, its resolution poor, but it was enough to make every investigator in the room lean in just a little closer. There, captured on a surveillance camera just a few houses down from Ashley Ellerin's home, was the figure of a man. He wasn't in motion, wasn't rushing toward a destination. He was standing still, half hidden in the shadows, his body positioned in the way of someone who had no intention of being seen, but also no fear of waiting. It was a predator's stance. Detective Thomas Grant stared at the image, his mind running through every possible scenario. The timestamp placed the man near Ashley Street less than an hour before her estimated time of death. He wasn't loitering randomly, he was watching. And then, just like that, he was gone. The questions began to pile up. Had he been waiting for Ashley to return home? Had he already been inside? If this was their suspect, why had he risked lingering in a residential area where anyone could have seen him? Nothing about the crime suggested recklessness. It had been calculated, precise, executed with the kind of confidence that only came from someone who had done this before. And that was the thought that disturbed Grant the most. Because if they were dealing with someone experienced, someone who knew exactly how to avoid detection, then they weren't just hunting a killer, they were hunting a ghost. The search for the man in the surveillance footage began immediately. Every available officer was tasked with combing through recent reports of suspicious activity, trespassing, or break-ins within a 5-mile radius of Ashley's home. The hope was that, somewhere, someone had encountered this man before. As the search continued, forensic analysts remained focused on the blood sample retrieved from the crime scene. Though no match had been found in the federal database, they had turned to a secondary option: genetic genealogy. It was a long shot, a tedious process of comparing DNA markers with public ancestry records, but it had cracked cold cases before. While that process played out behind the scenes, investigators pursued another angle: other women who may have been targeted. A pattern had already begun to emerge. Ashley had noticed subtle warning signs in the weeks before her murder: a strange presence near her home, unsettling moments that she couldn't fully explain but had dismissed out of fear of overreacting. Had there been others? Detectives reached out to women in the area, particularly those who fit Ashley's profile: young, attractive, independent. They combed through police reports of unusual encounters, particularly those involving an unknown man making unsolicited offers to help with household repairs or acting overly familiar without reason. It didn't take long before they found something. A woman, her name withheld for safety, came forward. She had lived in the same general neighborhood as Ashley, but had since moved. Months before Ashley's murder, she had an unsettling experience. She had been home alone when she heard a knock at her door. A man stood outside, clean-cut, unremarkable, offering to fix something around her house. The interaction had felt strange. He was persistent, overly eager to come inside. She had refused, and after a long, uncomfortable pause, he left. She had thought about it a few times after that. Something about the way he had looked at her had felt wrong, but without anything to go on, she had convinced herself she was being paranoid. Then Ashley had been murdered, and suddenly that moment didn't feel so harmless anymore. She worked with the police to put together a composite sketch. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, a face to attach to the growing terror. And when detectives placed the sketch next to the blurred surveillance photo, the resemblance was unmistakable. The manhunt intensified. With a loose physical description now in play, law enforcement worked around the clock, cross-referencing the image with known offenders, tracking down any similar reports from other precincts. Every available resource was thrown at the case, every effort made to piece together the puzzle before another woman was targeted. The urgency had shifted. This wasn't just about bringing justice to Ashley. It was about stopping a killer before he struck again. Because if he had done this before, he was already looking for his next victim, and he was still out there, waiting. The city never truly slept, but there were moments just before dawn, when the streets were empty save for the occasional headlights of a taxi, that it felt like it did. It was in these quiet hours, when most of the world had not yet stirred, that the real work of an investigation took shape. The precinct was a low hum of activity, the kind of quiet efficiency that came with cases that refused to be solved quickly. The composite sketch of the unknown man was pinned to the evidence board, next to the blurry surveillance image. Both faces, one indistinct, the other hastily drawn from memory, had become the focal point of the investigation. Every officer who passed that board stared at it, committing the image to memory, hoping it would trigger recognition. Detective Thomas Grant had barely left the precinct in days. The walls of his office were closing in, but exhaustion was a luxury he couldn't afford. He knew how cases like this went. If they didn't get a name soon, the momentum would slow. Leads would dry up, and somewhere out there, a killer would slip back into the shadows. They needed something, a mistake, a crack, or as it turned out, a second voice coming forward. The woman who had described the suspicious encounter was not the only one. After the sketch was released to law enforcement circles, another woman came forward with a similar story. She had lived across town but had encountered a man matching the description nearly a year earlier. He had approached her outside a grocery store, striking up a conversation that felt, at first, harmless. He had been polite, charming even, but there was something off about the way he lingered, how his questions felt a little too rehearsed. He had asked where she lived. When she had hesitated, his demeanor had shifted. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but the air had changed. She had lied, given him a vague answer, then left. But she had never quite shaken the feeling that he had already known, that the question hadn't been curiosity, it had been confirmation. Now, after hearing about the murder, she had begun to wonder, had she been another potential victim? Had she unknowingly walked away from something far worse? Her statement added another chilling layer to the profile they were building. This wasn't someone who chose his victims at random. He watched them first. He studied them. And if the pattern held, he would do it again. The composite sketch was now circulating beyond California. Detectives had reached out to law enforcement in Illinois, where the unsolved case of Trisha Picacho was still an open wound. Her case had long been a frustrating mystery, brutal, inexplicable, and lacking any definitive leads. Until now. The similarities between the two murders were impossible to ignore. The way both women had been attacked, the eerie suggestion that they had been stalked before their deaths, the unsettling sense that whoever had done this had not been in a hurry to leave the scene. It was as if he had wanted to be there. That thought unsettled Grant more than anything else. Killers who lingered at crime scenes did so for a reason. It wasn't about covering their tracks. It was about control, about extending the moment for as long as possible, savoring it, and that meant something even more chilling. The murder itself hadn't been the goal. The fear, the power, the total domination, that was what he had been after. The detectives' efforts began to take shape, though slowly. The forensic team was still running down leads on the DNA sample, hoping for a distant familial match through genetic genealogy. It was a long process, but it had solved cases before. In the meantime, officers worked through databases, trying to find anything, an old arrest, a traffic ticket, a witness statement that might match the man in the sketch. Every call was a potential break, every scrap of information a step toward identifying the man who had taken Ashley Ellerin's life. But he had been careful. There were no obvious missteps, no easy answers, only an invisible thread connecting the victims, leading somewhere unknown. And time was running out before he could find his next target. The case had begun to unravel in a way that no one could ignore. What had initially seemed like a single act of horrific violence was now part of something much larger, something that stretched across years, possibly even decades. Each passing day uncovered new details, new potential connections, and with every piece of evidence, the realization grew stronger. This wasn't the work of someone who had lost control in a moment of rage. This was the work of someone who had perfected his ability to kill. Detective Thomas Grant stood in the precinct, staring at the board where photographs of Ashley Ellerin and Trisha Picacho were pinned side by side. Their images, once full of life, had become stark reminders of lives stolen too soon. He could feel the weight of their stories, the unfinished chapters of their existence, cut short by someone who had made their deaths into something more than just murder. But despite the growing profile of the suspect, they still had no name. That was what haunted him the most. The DNA sample had confirmed what they already knew. It belonged to someone not yet in the system. The forensic genealogists were still working, trying to build a familial connection. But it was slow, frustrating work. Meanwhile, the composite sketch had brought in multiple tips, yet none of them had led anywhere concrete. It was as if their suspect had been careful his entire life. Careful not to leave a trace. Careful not to get caught. Careful in a way that suggested he had spent years learning exactly how to evade justice. But no one was perfect, and in that imperfection was the key to finding him. The investigation took a new turn when detectives expanded their scope, searching for other cases that might bear similarities to Ashley's murder. They weren't just looking for murders anymore. They were looking for attempts. Killers like this didn't wake up one day and commit their first murder with such precision. They escalated over time. There had to be others, women who had survived, women who had escaped. It didn't take long before they found one. Her name was Michelle Murphy. The attack had taken place in Santa Monica, in an apartment eerily similar to Ashley's. A space that should have been safe, a place where no one should have been able to enter without invitation. But someone had. And unlike Ashley, Michelle had lived to tell the story. Her case had initially been classified as an attempted burglary gone wrong, dismissed by the system because she had survived. But when detectives revisited the details, it was impossible not to see the connection. She had been asleep when she woke to the weight of someone on top of her. A man, strong, unrelenting. He had a knife, and he had tried to use it, but she had fought back. Against all odds, she had managed to kick him off, forcing him to flee. And when investigators compared the DNA recovered from her apartment to the blood found at Ashley's crime scene, the match was undeniable. They had him. Whoever he was, wherever he was, his DNA had finally given him away. But they still didn't have a name. As forensic specialists continued to work through genetic databases, detectives focused on the behavioral aspects of the case. The attacks weren't random, they were calculated. The suspect had watched his victims before striking. He had inserted himself into their lives in small, subtle ways, gaining just enough access to make his approach seem natural. He had studied them. He had followed them. And when he struck, he did so with the certainty of someone who had already rehearsed the crime in his mind. That was why he was so dangerous. This wasn't a man who killed in moments of weakness. This was a man who thrived on control. He took his time. He made sure there was no escape. But Michelle had escaped. And now, because of her, they had a direct forensic link between Ashley's murder and an attempted attack that had been classified as something else entirely. The pieces were finally coming together. But the question remained, where was he now? Because if he had done this before, he wasn't going to stop. He was just waiting for his next opportunity, and they had to find him before he took it. The name came on an ordinary afternoon, delivered in the form of an email from the forensic genealogy team. After weeks of tireless analysis, their painstaking work had finally led to a break, an identity buried within distant familial records, connecting the DNA found at Ashley Ellerin's crime scene to a man whose name had never been in the system before. Michael Gargiulo. The moment his name was spoken aloud, everything fell into place. His past, his movements, the pattern of violence that had followed him from Illinois to California, it was all there, waiting to be unraveled. He had lived near Ashley. He had lived near Trisha Picacho. He had lived near Michelle Murphy. Always close, always watching, always in the shadows. The detectives moved quickly, securing an arrest warrant. They knew that men like Gargiulo didn't stop. They didn't fade into the background after a single crime. If he was still free, it meant only one thing. He was already looking for his next victim. But the days of him slipping away were over. The arrest came without spectacle. The man who had evaded justice for years was finally cornered, and for the first time, he had nowhere to run. When the cuffs were placed around his wrists, he barely reacted. No outburst, no resistance, just silence. He knew it was over. Yet even as he sat in the interrogation room, staring at the wall, refusing to speak, there was something unsettling about him. Something that made every detective in the room feel as if they were looking at a man who had never once felt guilt, never once doubted himself. His crimes had never been about money. They had never been about revenge. They had been about control, about the power of life and death. But now, finally, that power had been taken from him. The trial was long, painful for the families of the victims, but it brought something they had waited years for: justice. Testimonies from forensic experts, survivors, and detectives painted a chilling picture of a predator who had moved undetected for decades, slipping into women's lives under the guise of helpfulness, of friendliness, before revealing the monster beneath. The prosecution laid out his crimes with precision, detailing how he had watched, how he had waited, how he had struck when his victims were most vulnerable. There was no remorse in his eyes, no regret, but the evidence was overwhelming. The DNA, the eyewitnesses, the matching patterns of his attacks. In the end, there was no doubt. Michael Gargiulo was found guilty, and in a final moment of reckoning, he was sentenced to death. But even with the trial over, even with his fate sealed, there were questions that would never have answers. How many others had there been? How many more women had been watched, followed, nearly chosen before he found his perfect victims? Was Trisha Pacaccio truly his first? Or was she simply the first one they knew about? The terrifying reality of cases like this was that killers didn't always leave behind a full record. Some victims were never found. Some cases remained unsolved, their connections never made. And while justice had been served, while the families of Ashley and Trisha and the other women he had harmed could finally breathe knowing he would never hurt another soul again, the weight of what he had done could never be erased. But there was one thing that could be learned. This case, like so many others, had begun long before the crimes themselves. It had started with warning signs, subtle ones, moments that had been brushed aside, feelings of unease that had been rationalized away. Women were taught to be polite, to give the benefit of the doubt. Ashley had felt uncomfortable, but she hadn't wanted to be rude. Trisha had been full of life, trusting, unaware that the boy she had known would be the one to end it. Michelle had sensed danger, but hadn't thought it could be real until it was almost too late. These moments, these instincts, they mattered. This case proved what so many had already known, but had been forced to ignore out of fear of being called paranoid. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Trusting that instinct could mean the difference between safety and tragedy. It could mean survival. It could mean everything. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.